大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Michael Lewis 嘅 Liar's Poker， 我哋去到第8節啦，叫做 From Geek to Man。咁上一節第7節咧就講咗80年代尾啦，呢個 Salomon Brothers 一個低潮啦。咁到底係咪跌到落去谷底咧，都未可知。但係呢個 Mortgage Department 咧，肯定就係土崩瓦解咗㗎啦。咁當中曾經活躍嘅經紀咧，佢哋全部都過檔去咗其他嘅投行高薪厚職啦。咁當中最出名嘅咧就係 Louis Rubin 啦。咁佢就去咗 Merrill Lynch， 但係後來都係因為一啲法律上嘅糾紛啦，咁亦都離咗職啦，亦都被解僱啦。好啦，我哋就睇下呢一節 From Geek to Man 睇下嗰個時間有冇向前推移啊，定係都係停留翻喺80年代先。Chapter 8 From Geek to Man. Men in general judge more by the sense of sight than by the sense of touch, because everyone can see but only a few can test by feeling. Everyone sees what you seem to be. Few know what you really are, and those few do not dare take a stand against the general opinion. Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince. I'm now convinced that the worst thing a man can do with a telephone without breaking the law is to call someone he doesn't know and try to sell that person something he doesn't want. On my lap, as I began my young career in sales in London, sat a book full of funny French names I couldn't pronounce. My boss, my jungle guide, a native of Bald Knob, a Kansas named Stu Williker, had told me to get my butt on the phone and start earning a living. Call everyone in Paris, he said, and smile. He didn't actually mean everyone in Paris. That was just for effect. I was meant to call only French money managers with $50 million or more. That whittled the field down from the white pages of the Paris phone book. I have found another book for the purpose, called the Euro Money Guide. To get your name listed in something called the Euro Money Guide, I figured you needed to have some money. The first name listed was F. Digerunian. What was that? Man or woman? I asked my American jungle guide how it should be pronounced. How should I know? I thought you spoke French, he said. No, that was just on my resume, I said. Oh, he said, and scratched his head for a minute, figuratively. That's all right. The frogs all speak English anyway. I was stumped. No choice but to dial. But that didn't solve the problem. F. Digerunian. Might it not rhyme with onion? Was the first part like the name of the philosopher? I decided to try Diderot's onion quickly. My jungle guide was staring at me as if I must be some mistake. I dialed. Oui, said a male frog. Bouge pas F. Digeronian? I asked. Quoi? Qui? Said the frog. F. Digeronian. Digeronian, said I. The man on the other end covered the receiver with his hand. I heard only muffled background conversation, but it sounded suspiciously like, Frank, there's some American broker who can't pronounce your name on the phone. Do you want to talk to him? Then another voice, find out who he is. Hey, who are you? The man asked. My name is Michael Lewis, and I'm with Salomon Brothers in London, I said. Muffle, muffle. Frank, some new guy with Salomon. Frank Digerunian. I don't talk to Salomon. Bastards. Tell him to go away. Frank says he'll have to call you back. Why did I take this job? A geek is a carnival performer who bites the heads off live chickens and snakes, or so says the Red American Heritage Dictionary. At Salomon Brothers in London, a geek meant whatever the traders said it meant, and they had two definitions, neither of which bore any resemblance to the dictionaries. Upon my arrival, a trader told me that a geek was both A. any person who sucks from swans, and B. a person immediately out of the training program and in a disgusting larval state between trainee and man. I, he said, was a geek. By December 1985, having served my time as both a waiter and a punching bag for traders in New York, I was happy to stop being a trainee, even if it meant becoming a geek. I planned to drift away from the 41st floor, from Ranieri, Goodfriend, Strauss, and Foote, and their oppressive turf war. Don't get me wrong, I like the action as much as the next guy, but in New York, when you're starting out, action comes at the price of freedom. I couldn't stand the thought of being set upon by fat mortgage traders until I learned to do my job. That could take a lifetime. If you wish to detach yourself from the soul of Salomon Brothers, London was the only place to go. Everywhere else, the standards were set by the 41st floor, in American branches and also in Tokyo. But the older Europeans who staffed the London office of Salomon were freedom fighters. The top 6 management positions in the office were held by Americans who had worked on 41st. The Europeans nevertheless set the pace. You had only to compare the reaction of our office to a visit from Goodfriend with those of the other office to see a difference between us and them. When Goodfriend appeared in any American branch office, the employees put on a show. They affected a casual confidence. Although their stomachs churned and their pants moistened, young Americans jested with the wandering Goodfriend. They said nothing terribly adventuresome. You understand, jokes about the latest bond issue were in. Jokes about Goodfriend's wife were out. As long as the ground rules were properly observed, Goodfriend gave it right back. When Goodfriend visited the Tokyo office, the Japanese employees bowed their heads at their desks and worked the phones furiously, as if playing charades and assigned to communicate men at work. The slumbering Japanese in our training program notwithstanding, the concept of playing cool apparently doesn't exist in Japan. No young Japanese peered skyward to chat with cherubic Goodfriend-san. An American friend of mine happened to be in the Tokyo office on one of Goodfriend's visits and was taken aside by the boss for a discussion. When my friend returned to the trading floor, he recalls, all the Japanese were staring at me as if I had just had a personal conversation with God and he had made me a saint. In London, Goodfriend was treated, quite simply, like a gauche American tourist. It would only have confirmed many people's opinion of him if he had turned up wearing psychedelic Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt with a camera around his neck. People laughed behind his back, especially as the firm spiraled into decline. What's he here for? One European would ask another. Must be on his way to Paris to do some shopping. The response would inevitably be. It was indeed often the case. The next question was then, is Susan with him? There is, in short, no question that the Europeans took less heed of authority than Salomon's Americans and Japanese. These free spirits were on average 10 to 15 years my senior and old hands in high finance. They were less interested in the latest financial gadget to come out of America than in establishing relationships with customers. There is a genus of European, species English, to whom slick financial practice comes naturally. The word for them in the Euro markets is spiffs. Oddly, we had no spiffs. Our Europeans, especially our Englishmen, tended to be the refined products of the right schools. For them, work was not an obsession or even, it seemed, a concern. And the notion that a person should subordinate himself to a corporation, especially an American corporation, was to them laughable. The Europeans had a reputation, probably exaggerated, of sleeping late, taking long liquid lunches, and stumbling through their afternoons. The source of this reputation was, as ever, the 41st floor in New York. One New York trader referred to them as Monty Python's flying investment bankers. The colorful and loud clash between their culture and the culture of the imported American management was a dust cloud behind which a geek could hide and retain a measure of personal freedom. Between the time I arrived at Salomon Brothers in London in December 1985 and the time I left in February 1988, a great deal changed. The staff grew from 150 to 900. We overhauled our image and moved into shiny new offices. Tens of millions of dollars were poured into our operation by the men on the 41st floor in New York who were intent on transforming Salomon Brothers into a global investment bank. John Goodfriend and Tom Strauss shared the conventional wisdom of Wall Street that there would one day be just a few truly global investment banks, that the losers would, presumably, stay home. Those few global banks would form an oligopoly that could lift the price of its capital-raising services and prosper. The firms regularly mentioned as likely to form the global club were the Japanese investment bank Nomura, the American commercial bank Citicorp, and the American investment banks First Boston, Goldman Sachs, and Salomon Brothers. And the European banks? I don't think we even knew their names. Tokyo was the obvious site for our rapid expansion because Japanese trade surplus left it gorged with dollars it had either to sell or to invest. The Japanese were the Arabs of the 1980s, but because American firms felt unwelcomed by Japan's financial establishment, and because financial regulation was labyrinthine in Japan, the Japanese offices of Wall Street firms tended to be small and tentative. Meanwhile, there was no obvious barrier to entry in Europe. There was little financial regulation, and the Atlantic cultural divide seemed less daunting than the Pacific to native New Yorkers. When a kid from Brooklyn disembarked at Heathrow Airport, he didn't need an interpreter to hire a limousine. When he sat down to dinner in his expensive hotel, he wasn't served raw fish, but stuff that looked pretty much like American food. It was easy for this man to fool himself that Europe was a lot like New York because on $2,000 a day it was. So London became the key link in this drive for world domination. Its time zone, its history, its language, its relative political stability, its large pools of dollar-hungry capital and Harrods made London central to the plans of all American investment bankers, and the global aspirations of Salomon Brothers settled in London. I was a geek salesman, one of 12 from my training class, airmail business class to London. Our offices, when I began, occupied 2 small donut-shaped floors in a building owned by Morgan Guarantee in the city. Trading is meant to require a fast hangar in which everyone can see and shout at everyone else. Our building had been effectively called by the placement of too many elevators and staircases at its center. The trading floor wound around the core. Fully extended, it might have stretched 50 yards, but sitting on it, you could see only a short way. Still, there was a cramped commercial feel about the place. We sat elbow to elbow. Everyone knew what everyone else was doing. It was loud and, with the exception of its postcard view of the River Thames and the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, unpleasant. The 12 sales units in London office were merely extensions of the New York parent operations. One unit sold corporate bonds, a second mortgage bonds, a third government bonds, a fourth American equities, and so on. What I would sell had been decided for me while I was in the training program. The man to whom I was now committed, for better or for worse, for richer and for poorer, was named Dick Leahy. He ran Salomon Brothers' bond options and future sales department, a rogue offshoot of the government department. That made me, by birth as it were, a member of the Strauss family. Leahy and his right-hand woman, Leslie Christian, formally assumed responsibility for me in the final days of the training program, over turkey sandwiches. This was a lucky break. First, because no one else wanted me except the equity department, and second, because I liked them. Being their geek was an unusual assignment. Unlike most managers who had an obsessive concern with moving their products out the door, Rabbi Christian and Rabbi Leahy told me to find any way I could to make money and not to worry too much about pushing options and futures. They, rightly, aligned their self-interest with the interests of the firm as a whole. This made them highly unusual. It made me, in a firm of specialists seeking to please their bosses, an unofficial generalist with a license to roam the entire firm. On my first day in London, I introduced myself to Leahy's London manager, Stu Williker. Before I arrived, his unit consisted of 3 other salesmen. Williker was another lucky break. He hadn't caught the Salmon disease. He'd been in London 4 years but refused to forget that Boltnob was his birthplace. That was refreshing. More to the point, he had taken one look at the mass of written and unwritten rules that govern the behavior of most Salomon employees and chose to have nothing to do with them. He valued his liberty. He paid almost no attention to what he was told to do and encouraged his charges to intransigence. Paradoxically, he suffered from bouts of tyranny. Every so often, he would issue orders, such as call everyone in Paris, but these were rare and well worth what he gave in return. He let us cut office meetings and work our own hours. He led by example, by arriving at work each morning an hour after the rest of the sales force had made its first phone calls. This, I think, was an inspired gesture. He was the most profitable unit in the office, year in and year out, and I'm sure it was because its members were left with room to think for themselves. Thinking, as yet, was a feat beyond my reach. I had no base, no grounding. My only hope was to watch the salesmen around me and gather what advice I could. Learning what to do meant learning an attitude, how to sound on the telephone, how to deal with traders, and most important, how to spot the difference between a financial opportunity and a rip-off. 2 days after I'd found a seat on the London trading floor, with the phones going berserk with Frenchmen and Englishmen wanting to gamble in the great American bull market, I received my first piece of advice. The young man directly across from me, a member of my unit whom I'd spent the next 2 years gazing upon in wonderment, leaned over and whispered, "Want to know a layup? Short the stock of Salomon Brothers." A layup, it should be said, was jargon for a gamble that was sure to succeed. To sell short or to short is to sell a security that you don't own, hoping that it will decline in price and you can buy it back later at a lower price. To short our own stock would be to bet on its taking a nosedive. I should have gasped and recoiled in horror. First, shorting the stock of your own company is illegal. And second, it didn't sound like such a great idea, though perhaps it wasn't a bad hedge, to bet against Salomon Brothers. The firm was having the second most profitable year in its and Wall Street's history. My friend, who goes here by his chosen pseudonym of Dick Riprock, didn't mean I should actually do the deed. He was simply making a point, stating a fact, in his inimitably succinct style. He had sized me up, he later explained, and had decided to take me under his wing. This meant he would occasionally cast in my direction the pearls of wisdom he had accumulated in 9 months on a job. He was American, and only 23, 2 years younger than I. Still, in the way of the world, he was light years ahead of me. Dash Riprock was a proven money maker. I soon grew used to him. Dash often made remarks I didn't understand, such as buy 2-year notes and short hold 10s, or short Salomon stock, or save a client, shoot a geek, and expect me to figure out why on my own. Often I hadn't a clue what he meant, but Dash, for all his pithiness, had a kind heart. And eventually, after he'd sold 4 different money managers in 3 different countries on whatever new scheme he was promoting, he'd elaborate. In this way, I learned about trading, selling, and life. Dash's point on this occasion was that Salomon Brothers was a poor investment in spite of all the vital signs of the companies being healthy. This, I was to learn, is the best time to short, the moment before business turns sour. But how did he know that the time had come for Salomon? As a geek, you see, I was like a newly elected president. I wasn't expected to know anything except that I didn't know and that it wasn't my fault. So I asked, why? Of course, I didn't expect him to come right out and explain. That would have been too easy. Dash spoke in cryptic sentence fragments. He just waved his hand in the direction of the rest of the trading floor and said, it's a corporation. Strictly speaking, this was a truism. Salomon Brothers was a corporation, Philbro Salomon Incorporated, but I knew what he meant. We like to think we were free from most of what that terrible world implies. Superfluous meetings, empty memos, and stultifying hierarchy. Dash had looked up from his phone one day and seen a growing bureaucracy, and it disturbed him. To support his case, Dash raised his index finger like a Roman orator and said, consider the book and the ball. That said, he wheeled around in his swivel chair and picked up a blinking light. Soon he was well into a sales rep. Fed's doing reverse. I don't know. Market often soften a touch overnight. We are seeing supply. You might put on 2s to 10s, all of which meant nothing whatever to me. I scribbled a note to ask about it later. The book and the ball. Salomon was then celebrating his 75th anniversary. To commemorate the great day, all employees received 2 gifts. A large silver-plated bowl with the name of the company inscribed on its side and a book. The bowl was good for putting Doritos in. The book, called Salomon Brothers Advance to Leadership, was a selective history of the company that had as its sole purpose the glorification of the people on top. It accomplished the task in a nice enough way. Goodfriend, Ranieri, Horowitz, Foote, Strauss, and Massey were quoted as if following a script. They were modest about themselves and thoughtful about the world. The author then filled in the blanks about how wise, handsome, brave, and team-spirited they were. The book was a fine little specimen of clumsy fascist propaganda. Those in future training programs were made to memorize its contents. Even to a trainee, the book was a ridiculous cover-up job. The firm had advanced to leadership, but not as one big happy family. At that point, there were more skeletons in the firm than there was closet space to hold them. The son of the founder, William Salomon, otherwise reserved and dignified, marched about the place calling Goodfriend a disgrace to any reporter who'd listen. The flowers were still fresh on the grave of former chairman David Tendler, whom Goodfriend had muscled aside in ascending to the chairmanship of Philbo Salomon Inc. The struggle between Ranieri, Strauss, and Foote was nearly its bloody climax. Bond traders were streaming out of the door for better offers elsewhere. Of course, little of the firm's dark past and present appeared in the official sanitized history. In explaining the birth of the mortgage department, for example, the author unearthed old newspaper quotes from the likes of Bob Dow, saying, "What Salomon has that no other major firm has is a tremendous flexibility to let your skills end up where they are most productive." The most interesting thing about this statement is what was going on behind the speaker's back when he made it. The quote was recorded 6 months before Dow was shoved aside by Ranieri to be left twisting in the wind by Goodfriend. Goodfriend is the book's hero. He is cast as a kind of Isaiah figure. an unworldly suffering servant of Solomon. He describes making his transition from trader to manager, for example, with this passage. While I enjoy the management role, he said, it's because I feel a challenge, not because I think it's the most gratifying job in the world. The world of finance can, on occasion, involve us the highest calling. From time to time, we have had the opportunity to influence society in a favorable way. He sounded like an elder statesman, cues the accompanying text. But the disinformation was not what bothered Dash about the book and the ball. Once you knew the truth about the firm, you realized it was far better to disinform than to inform. And if your leaders were going to lie about their methods, they were almost by necessity going to tell a whopper. What bothered Dash was that Salomon Brothers had actually spent money to make these things. A book and a ball? Who gave him, he said, about a book and a ball. He'd rather have the money. What's more, he added, the people who worked at Salomon in the old days would never have done such a thing. They, too, would rather have had the money. The book and the ball violated what Dash considered to be the Salomon ethic, and that's why he told me to short the stock. I made a careful note of this exchange in a slim volume in which I stashed anything that sounded like wisdom. Earlier on, my notes indicate I was made aware of the possibility that my seemingly robust employer was in fact in a state of decay. Otherwise, I don't trust myself when describing my first few months on the job because the memory of how I arrived was very quickly obscured by what I became. For an honest appraisal of my early self, I must rely, to an extent, on others. Plenty of people at Salomon Brothers made a hobby of brutally frank character analysis. For example, Dash later often amused himself between phone calls by reflecting on my early career, usually with a pen in the corner of his mouth. He was fond of saying that as a geek, I bore the stamp of whomever I had last spoken with. I was, he felt, uncommonly soft-brained upon my arrival. If I had last spoken to the mortgage bond trader, I would be on the phones to people to say what a good deal mortgage bonds were. If I had last spoken to a corporate bond trader, I would think that the latest issue of IBM bonds was a gold mine. Unfortunately, Dash did not make real-time observation about my character. He let me know of my flaws only after they had wrought a great deal of damage. In fairness to him, he had no choice. Like all of us, he lived by the law of the jungle. And the law of the jungle said geek salesmen are red meat for traders, no exceptions. If a corporate trader had managed to dupe me into thinking that IBM bonds were hot, that was my problem. Had Dash disabused me of the notion, the corporate trader would have tried to take whatever it cost him out of Dash's next bonus. Dash liked me, but not that much. Still, I relied heavily on Dash and on the other members of our unit, a woman and 2 men. We sat at a single desk, divided artificially to accommodate 5. We had 100 telephone lines. Each line was a channel through which money, tasteless jokes, and rumors flowed. If you ever care to see how all the world's most awful jokes spread, spend a day on the bond trading desk. When the Challenger's space shuttle disintegrated, 6 people called me 6 points on a globe to explain that NASA stands for Need Another 7 Astronauts. Rumors were far more relevant than bad jokes because rumors move markets. It was widely believed that a small bald man in a grubby room in Moscow started all rumors to wreak havoc on our Western market-based economy. The rumors bore an uncanny resemblance to whatever people feared most. Often the most unlikely of rumors caused panic in the markets. In 2 years, for example, Paul Volcker resigned from his post as chairman of the Federal Reserve 7 times and died twice. We had on our desks 3 telephone receivers each. 2 were standard phones. The third enabled you to shout directly at any person in any office in the Salomon Empire. Several dozen phone lights flashed continually on our telephone boards. European investors wanted to place their bets on the American bond market from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. There was good reason for their eagerness. The American bond market was shooting through the roof. Imagine how cowards would overwhelm a casino in which everyone who plays wins big. And you have some idea of what our unit was like in those days. The attraction of options and futures, our specialty item, was that they offered both liquidity and fantastic leverage. They were a mechanism for gambling in the bond markets, like super chips in a casino that represent $1,000 but cost only $3. In fact, there are no super chips in casinos. Options and futures have no equivalent in the world of professional gambling because real casinos would consider the leverage they afford imprudent. For a tiny down payment, a buyer of futures contract takes the same risk as in owning a large number of bonds. In a heartbeat, he can double or lose his money. When it came to speculation, European investors didn't require a great deal of encouragement or instruction. They'd been doing crazy things with money for centuries. The French and the English, in particular, shared a weakness for get-rich-quick schemes. And like a crap shooter who has a pretty lady to blow on his dice, the speculators in both countries had an amazing array of irrational systems to help them win money. They had to guess which direction the American bond market would take, up or down. The system usually involved staring for hours at charts showing the history of bond prices. As in Rorschach inkblots, an unlikely formation, such as a human head and shoulders, made itself privately known to the viewer. The chartist, for that is what such a person called himself, would then use his ruler and pencil to draw the future of bond prices based on the assumption that the historical pattern could be projected forward. Miraculously, in a bull market, the resulting forecast was usually that the market was going up. Actually, there was one good reason for using the charts. Everyone else did. If you believed the large sums of money were about to be invested on the basis of a chart, then as dumb as it made you feel, it made sense to look at that chart. Perhaps it would enable you to place your bet first and get in front of the coming wave. Many of our French and English speculators, however, honestly believe the charts contain the secrets of the market. They are aboriginal chartists. They would have used the charts even if no one else did. They communed with the charts as if they were Ouija boards. The charts were speaking to them. Now, I admit, even for a geek, it was a little embarrassing to let investors believe their white magic. But as long as the chartists placed their bets with me, my jungle guide explained, the reasoning for our customers were not for me to question. Just the opposite. Only days after landing in my new job, I found myself praising such statements from investors as I was looking at the 10-day moving average last night, and it is a perfect reverse ducktail and pheasant. Let's bet the wrench. At this juncture, my role was only to shout encouragement. Yeah, do it. In need of a euphemism for what we did with other people's money, we called it arbitrage, which was just plain obfuscation. Arbitrage means trading risklessly for profit. Our investors always took risk. High wire act would have been more accurate than arbitrage. In spite of the responsibility implied by my job, I was ignorant and malleable when I advised my first customers. I was an amateur pharmacologist, prescribing drugs without a license. The people who suffered as a result were, of course, my customers. I couldn't help noticing that they were different from the customers of established salesmen. Mine were small institutional investors, defined as those with less than $100 million each who, on each trade, would commit only a few million. The other three salesmen in my unit were speaking almost exclusively to insurance companies, money managers, and European central banks that could, if they liked the trade idea, commit $50 to $100 million in a matter of seconds. The largest of these controlled perhaps $20 billion in investable funds. There was an excellent reason my jungle guide manager didn't let me lay my hands on the larger investors. He knew that, soft-brained as I was dangerous. His plan was for me to learn on the small clients so that if disaster struck, the effect on overall business of Salmon Brothers would be negligible. It was assumed that I might well put a customer or two out of business. That was part of being a geek. There was a quaint expression when a customer went under. He was said to have been blown up. Once I've learned to do my job, once I've stopped blowing up customers, I would be permitted to advise the big investors. A few days after I arrived, I was told by said jungle guide to start smiling and dialing. Cold calling, as I have pointed out, was not my idea of fun. I discovered immediately I was temperamentally unsuited to it. It made me feel like too much of a pest to do it well. And when he saw I was having no success, my jungle guide finally gave up the ghost and told me to phone a man named Herman at the London branch of an Austrian bank. This was convenient for everyone. Herman wanted to be sold to by Salmon Brothers because he had only a few $1 million to play with. No one else at Salmon Brothers wanted to sell to Herman, and in order to eat, I needed customers. Poor Herman never knew what hit him. I proposed lunch, and he accepted. He was a tall, gruff German with an incredibly deep voice and the distinct impression that he was born to trade. He thought he was very, very smart. It was my job to encourage him in this view, since the smarter he felt, the more he traded, and the more he traded, the more business he could give me. His bank had given him authority to risk $20 million. In spite of his cunning, Herman didn't know a geek when he saw one. I explained to him how this $20 million the two of us could make a fortune. Salomon Brothers was full of shrewd, knowing people, I said, and we would draw from their reservoir of ideas. I allowed how I myself was known to have an idea or two, and my advice was greatly valued by certain large European investors. At the end of lunch, during which we examined lots of Salomon's scientific graphs about bonds, talked a bit about head and shoulders patterns, and drank a bottle of wine, he decided he could do business with me. But Michael, remember, he said several times, we need good ideas. A large corporate bond trader was waiting for me, like an unfed house pet, when I returned to the office. He was glad to hear the lunch had gone well, and as it happened, he had a great idea for me and my new customer. He had been watching the Eurobond market all day and had noticed that AT&T's 30-year bonds had really become cheap, as measured against the benchmark 30-year US Treasury bond. The 650 billion Eurobond market, it should be said, was one of the main reasons for Salomon Brothers' presence overseas. A Eurobond is a bond issued in Europe and bought mainly by Europeans. Many large American companies issued Eurobonds, usually because they could borrow money more cheaply from European than from Americans, but occasionally to advertise their names abroad. Salomon, with its network of contacts in corporate America, was a leader in the market. Anyway, the trader said the street, meaning other Wall Street and London traders, was undervaluing AT&Ts. He knew where he could put his hands on a few AT&Ts. What I should tell my new client to do, he said, was to buy the AT&Ts and at the same time sell short 30-year US Treasury bonds. The trick, he explained, was to avoid being long or short the bond market. Instead, we would be making the exoteric bet that AT&T bonds would outperform US Treasury bonds. It sounded complicated. I wanted to be careful. I asked if the strategy was risky. Don't worry, he said. Your guy will make money. I have never done these things before, but it sounds like a good idea, said the still tipsy Herman when I told him. Do 3 million. My first order. I felt thrilled and immediately called a US Treasury trader in New York and sold him $3 million worth of Treasury bonds. Then I shouted over to the London corporate bond trader, you can do 3 million of the ATTs, trying, of course, to sound as if it really weren't that big a deal, just another trade, like going for a walk in the park. There was in every office of Salomon a system-wide loudspeaker, called the Hoot and Holler or just the Hoot. Apart from money, success in Salomon meant having your name shouted over the Hoot. The AT&T's trader's voice came loudly over the Hoot. Mike Lewis had just sold 3 million of our AT&Ts for us. A great trade for a desk. Thank you very much, Mike. I was flushed with pride, you understand. But something didn't quite fit. What did he mean, our AT&Ts? I hadn't realized the AT&T bonds had been on Salomon's trading books. I thought my trader friend had snapped them up from stupid dealers at other firms. If the bonds were ours to begin with, Dash was staring at me, disbelieving. You sold those bonds? Why? He asked. Because the trader said it was a great trade, I said. No. Dash put his head in his hands, as if in pain. I could see he was smiling. No, laughing. What else is the trader going to say? He said. He's been sitting on that position for months. It's underwater. He's been dying to get rid of it. Don't tell him I told you this, but you're going to get How can I get I said. The trader made me a promise. You are going to get Dash said again. That's all right because you're just a geek. Geeks were born to be He meant this a nice way, to absolve me, as it were. He then replaced his pen in the corner of his mouth, gave it a thoughtful twist or two, and began to work the phones like a jockey. What is the price of the ATT bonds? A familiar voice was shouting at me the next morning. No longer was he cool and self-assured. Herman had apparently been enlightened by some other trader in London. Everyone in London but Herman and I, it seemed, knew that Salomon Brothers owned AT&Ts and had been desperate to unload them. Herman was beginning to sense that he was going to get I held out hope. Not much, but I did think that if I went and stood over a trader, told him how upset my new customer was, told him that this did not bode well for our new relationship, showed him how awful I felt that he might buy the AT&T bonds back from my customer at the same price he had sold them to him the previous day. They aren't doing real well, said the trader when I asked him the price, but they'll come around. What's the price? I asked again. I'll have to get back to you on that, he said. No way, I said. I've got a boiling German on hold. I've got to know. The trader pretended to shuffle through some complicated-looking sheets to punch a few numbers into his Quotron machine. This, I learned, was standard practice when a customer was about to be sacrificed for the greater good of Salomon. The trader tried to transfer the blame to some impersonal scientific force. It's the numbers, don't you see? I can't do anything for you. It was painfully apparent the AT&T trader was stalling. Something was very wrong. I could bid you $95 for them, he finally said. You can't do that, I said. You sold the thing to me at $97 yesterday, and the market hasn't moved. The treasuries are the same price. I can't go tell my customer his AT&Ts have gone into a 2.3 fall overnight. He's out of pocket $60,000. I told you they weren't doing very well, he said. What do you mean? You lied to me. I started to shout. Look, he said, losing his patience. Who do you work for? This guy or Solomon Brothers? Who do you work for? That question haunted salesmen. Whenever a trader screwed a customer and the salesman became upset, the trader would ask the salesman, who do you work for anyway? The message was clear. You work for Solomon Brothers. You work for me. I pay your bonus at the end of the year, so just shut up, you geek. All of which was true, as far as it went. But if you stood back and looked at our business, this was a ridiculous attitude. A policy of screwing investors could lead to ruin. If they ever caught on, we'd have no investors. Without investors, we'd have no business raising money. The only justification, if you can call it that, I ever heard for our policy came unwittingly from our president, Tom Strauss, himself a former salesman of government bonds. At lunch with one of my customers, apropos of nothing and everything, he offered this opinion. Customers have very short memories. If that was the guiding principle of Salomon Brothers in the Department of Customer Relations, then all was suddenly clear. Screw them. They'll eventually forget about it. Right. However, you had to admire Strauss's frankness. It was one thing to screw a customer. It was another to tell him in advance you were going to do. The difference in style between the AT&T trader and Strauss was the same as between a sucker punch and a duel. Still, neither was great for business. One thing my customer never forgot was that Salomon Brothers thought he had a short memory. I had made the mistake of trusting a Salomon Brother trader. He had drawn on the pooled ignorance of me and my first customer to unload one of his mistakes. He had saved himself and our firm $60,000. I was at once furious and disillusioned, but that didn't solve the problem. Bell-yacking to the trader wasn't going to get me anywhere. That much was clear. He just docked my bonus at the end of the year. Bell-yacking would also make me look like a fool, as if I actually had thought the customer was going to make money on the AT&Ts. How could anyone be so stupid as to trust a trader? The best thing I could do was pretend to others at Salomon that I had meant to screw the customer. People would respect that. That was called jamming. I had just jammed bonds, albeit unknowingly, for the first time. I had lost my innocence. But what did I tell Herman the German? Don't let your $60,000 loss bother you too much. You have a short memory, and you soon forget. Sorry, I'm new at this. And guess what? Haha, you've just been had. Hi, sorry to take so long. It's really busy here, I said, rifling through the range of tones I might adopt. I was unable to find anything exactly appropriate to the occasion and settled on sounding cheerful. I must have managed an expression halfway between a brave smile and the grin of an idiot. Dash was watching the charade and laughing. Now that was unnecessary. I flipped him the finger. I was more embarrassed for myself than I was concerned for Herman. I just spoke with the trader, I said to my new customer, and he said that the AT&Ts didn't do very well overnight, but they will definitely come around soon. What is the price? He asked again. Oh, let me see. About 95, I said and felt my face wince. Ah, he shouted, as if he had been stabbed with a knife. He had lost all ability to articulate his feelings. His primal Teutonic scream captured for all time the collective pain felt by the valued customers of Salomon Brothers. What I didn't know but soon learned was that he never imagined in his whole life losing $60,000. His bank had given him $20 million to trade, but would not let him lose $60,000 of it. If it knew he was down that much money, it'd fire him. Actually, his story was more gruesome than that. He had a baby, a pregnant wife, and a new house in London with a large mortgage. This emerged only later, however. At the moment of impact, all he could do was make noises. The agony, the horror. Ugh, he continued, in a slightly different key. He began to hyperventilate into the phone. And you want to know how I felt? I should have felt guilty, of course. But guilt was not the first identifiable sensation to emerge from my exploding brain. Relief was, I had told him the news. He was shouting and moaning, and that was it. That was all he could do, shout and moan. That was the beauty of being a middleman, which I did not appreciate until that moment. The customer suffered. I didn't. He wasn't going to kill me. He wasn't even going to sue me. I wasn't going to lose my job. On the contrary, I was a minor hero at Salomon for dumping a $60,000 loss into someone else's pocket. There was a convenient way of looking at the situation. My customer did not like his loss, but it was just as much his own fault as mine. The law of the bond market is caveat emptor. That is Latin for buyer aware. I mean, he didn't have to believe me when I told him AT&T bonds were a good idea. Anyway, who was hurt besides my German? It is an important question, because it accounts for the detachment with which disasters were viewed at Salomon. The German bank had lost $60,000. The bank's shareholders, the Austrian government, were therefore the losers. To take it one step farther, the Australian taxpayer was the loser. But compared with the assets of the nation as a whole, $60,000 was a ridiculously small sum. In other words, it was hard to generate sympathy for anyone but the man who had done the trade, and he was partly responsible. He shouldn't blame me entirely. I might have thought had my capacity for rationalization been that of a man rather than a geek, but oh, how he did. For that is the customer's privilege and a bond salesman's burden. And he didn't just blame me once. He blamed me hundreds of times. For having made the first mistake of doing the trade, we promptly made the second of holding on to it. Each morning and each afternoon for the next few weeks, I awaited his bitterly sarcastic phone calls in a frozen state of dread. A thick German voice on the other end of the line would say, "This bond is a really good idea, Michael. Have you any more great ideas up your sleeve?" As a matter of fact, Herman gave up hoping he would survive intact. He gave up hope that Salomon would restore his losses. His sole reason for calling was to shower abuse upon me. Till death did they part, my customer and his bonds. AT&T's bonds got cheaper and cheaper. Finally, about a month after the ordeal had begun, my customer's boss inquired into his activities. A loss of about $140,000 dutifully raised its hoary head, and my German was fired. Kaboom! He got another job, and as far as I know, his children are well provided for. It was not an auspicious part to my career. Within a month, I'd blown up my first and only customer. There were, thankfully, plenty more where he came from. All met the two requirements to speak with a geek. First, that they be small investors, and second, that they be so awed by Salomon Brothers as to assume anything they were told was good advice. I passed a period of a few months on the phone with dozens of the least desirable clients in Europe. Among them, there was a cotton trader in Beirut, an Irish insurance company with a taste for speculating in currency options, and an American pizza mogul living in Monte Carlo. I blew up the insurance company, this time in an act of stupidity unassisted by traders. I was told not to do business with the man from Beirut by the Salomon Brothers Credit Committee, for fear that he might blow us up before I blew him up. And I lost the Monte Carlo pizza mogul when he decided to give up bonds and return to pizza. But not before he delivered for posterity the memorable line, "The casinos down here are dull compared to the we do." That was true. Perhaps my favorite encounter during these first couple of months, however, was with the head of an English brokerage firm. This man of minor distinction in the city of London somehow got my name and called me at Salomon. He said he wanted to hear all about options and futures, and for that purpose, I should visit him in his office. The company he managed was one of hundreds of small European financial institutions that were competing with Salomon, but at the same time had money to play with. They often masqueraded as potential customers in order to get information. They thought Salomon Brothers knew something other firms did not. I could have declined to meet him on the ground he might well use what information he gleaned from me to expand his business at the expense of mine. But he did have some funds to invest, and I was curious about Old English moneymen. And anyway, at that point, what I knew about options and futures was more likely to bankrupt than to help him. He was a portly, middle-aged figure in an ill-fitted suit, scuffed black shoes, and the sort of sagging, thin black socks I came to recognize as a symbol of Britain's long economic decline. There were other features incongruous with his station in life. Cowlicks standing high on the back of his head took on lives of their own. His clothes were rumpled as if he had slept in them. He was the boss of an operation of several hundred people, and he looked like a bum or as if he had just wakened from a long nap. We sat in his poorly lit office surrounded by more unfinished work than I've ever seen in one place and talked for an hour. More accurately, he talked for an hour about world events. I listened. Finally, he tired and called a car to take us to lunch. But before leaving his office, he paged through his Times with a sharp pencil in his hand and said, "I must make a bet." He dialed what I gathered to be his bookie and placed 2 bets of £5 each on horses racing that day. As he put down the phone, he said, "I view the bond market as an extension of horse racing, you know." I didn't, of course. I got the feeling I was supposed to be impressed. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the boys on my trading floor would have laughed him out of the casino at the suggestion of a bet as small as £5. And I couldn't help remembering a snide remark made by a seasoned trader to one of my fellow trainees while we were in the classroom. The trainee had tried to impress the trader and failed. The trader had said, "You are proof that some people are born to be customers." Born to be customers. The back row had thought it was the funniest thing they had heard all day. Anyway, we then took one of those 2-hour lunches for which the London office was fairly renowned in New York. Again, he talked. Again, I listened. About how the bond market rally was overdone, about how absurdly diligent he felt American backers were, and about how his small firm was going to cope with giants like Salmon invading the city of London. He disapproved of work days longer than 8 hours because, he said, you didn't arrive at the office in the morning with the same thoughts you left with late the night before. On the heels of a few drinks, this sounded wise enough to note on a napkin. We ordered a second bottle of white wine to go with the fish. At the end of lunch, as our speech slurred and the blood rushed from our brains to our stomachs, he remembered why he'd asked me out. He said, "We haven't had a chance to discuss options and futures. We'll have to do this again sometime." Before that could happen, however, his firm, like so many small English financial firms, was bought by an American bank for an inevitably large sum of money. He bailed out at just the right time and floated the short distance to Earth in a golden parachute. I never heard from him again. It was all new, all fresh. Early on, I made my first business trip to Paris. Once I'd escaped the trading floor, I was no longer a geek, or at least no one needed to know that I was a geek. I was an investment banker with an investment banker's expense account. For $400 a night, I stayed in the finest hotel in Paris, the Bristol. This was not an unusual extravagance on my part. All traveling Salmon tradesmen stayed at the Bristol. I would have had to plead for cheaper lodging with Salmon secretaries to prevent the expense. And when I first passed through the Bristol's gold doors, onto its long marble floor, and glimpsed the patter-patter scenes and goblin tapestries, when I saw the pharmacy of toiletries in my bathroom and the gilded luxury of my suite, I was glad that I had just taken what was my due. If Willy Loman had only had it so good, his kids might have turned out better. None of my activities in the first couple of months made so much as a dent on the bottom line of Salmon Brothers, but all were highly entertaining. What was more important than immediate results, I figured, was my education. I was nickeled during those first few months by the feeling of being a Charlatan. I kept blowing people up. I didn't know anything. I had never managed money. I had never made any real money. I didn't even know anyone who had made any real money, only a few heirs. Yet I was holding myself out as a great expert on matters of finance. I was telling people what to do with millions of dollars when the largest financial complication I had ever encountered was a $325 overdraft in my account at the Chase Manhattan Bank. The only thing that saved me in meeting after meeting in the early days of Salmon was that the people I dealt with knew even less. London is, or was, a great refuge for hacks. It was only a matter of time before I embarrassed myself horribly. I scrambled to learn more and managed to keep a half step ahead of humiliation. I was impressionable, as Stash Riprock delighted in pointing out, and that was a great weakness in the hands of shifty Salmon traders. But in my educating myself, it proved to be a great strength. I had the ability to imitate. It enabled me to get inside the brain of another person, to learn how to make smart noises about money. I studied the 2 best Salmon salesmen I knew, Dash Riprock himself and a man on the 31st floor of Salmon, New York, whom I shall call, at his request, Alexander. My training amounted to absorbing and synthesizing their attitudes and skills. Lucky for me, they turned out to be two of the best bondmen in the business. Dash and Alexander were as opposite as individuals as their respective choice of pseudonyms suggests, and their respective skills differed also. Dash did what most salesmen did, only better. He kept his nose pressed up against the green screens on which the market in U.S. government bonds were trading and looked for small discrepancies in price. To anyone but a born bond salesman, his daily routine was painfully dull. There are several hundred different U.S. government bonds, ranging in maturity from a few months to 30 years. Dash knew what their prices should be, which large investor owned which bonds, and who was the weak hand in the market. If a price was off by 1/8 of 1%, he'd pile half a dozen institutional investors into a trade to make that 1/8 of 1%. He called his technique nips for blips. Blips being the little green numbers that represent bond prices on the screens. I never learned what nips meant, but the expression became a pun as an increasing number of Dash's customers were Japanese. Tens of billions of dollars worth of U.S. government bonds passed through his phone in a year. En route from the U.S. government to Japan, Dash was doing his patriotic bit to fund the U.S. trade deficit. Salmon took a tiny slice out of each trade. Dash expected at the end of each year to be paid a tiny slice of Salmon's cut. Alexander was unique, the closest thing I met to a master of markets, which I'm now convinced no man really is. He was 27, 2 years older than I, and had been with Salomon Brothers for 2 years when I arrived. He had grown up trading a portfolio of securities. He recalls making a killing in the stock market while in the 7th grade. At the age of 19, he lost $97,000 on U.S. Treasury bill futures. He was not, in other words, a normal child. Once he learned to write his gains and cut his losses, he never looked back. What he lost in T-bills, he made back several times over in gold futures. Alexander knew how to exploit the world's financial market. What's more, as a salesman, he knew how to sound as if he knew how to exploit the world's financial markets. And he had the same effect on other men in our little world as sirens have on sailors. Within months after he moved from London and on to the 41st floor in New York, he had been discovered by a handful of managing directors who wanted to know what to do with their own money. You'd have thought they'd be comfortable making their own investment decisions, but they weren't. Each day they'd ask Alexander for advice. To get it, however, they had to stand in line behind Alexander's clients and me. Alexander was a salesman, but like all the very best salesmen, he had the instincts of a trader. For all intents and purposes, he was a trader. His customers and his bosses simply did whatever he told them to. Alexander had a knack for interpreting events around him. The most impressive aspect of this was its speed. When news broke, he seemed to have already planned his response. He trusted his nose completely. If he had a flaw, it was that he lacked the ability to question his own immediate reactions. He saw the markets as a tightly woven web. Yank on one filament in the web, and the other filaments had to move too. He therefore traded in all markets, the bonds, currencies, and stocks of France, Germany, the United States, Japan, Canada, and Britain. The markets in oil, precious metals, and bulk commodities all interested him. The luckiest thing that happened to me during the period I spent at Salomon Brothers was having Alexander take me into his confidence. We met when I replaced him in London. For 2 years prior to my arrival, he had worked for Stu Williker and beside Dash Riprock. When we met, he was returning to New York to be a bond salesman on the 41st floor. There was no reason for him to watch over me, except for the mango tea which he required me to smuggle in bulk to him from Paris. There was nothing in it for him. It was a genuinely selfless act, which I recount only because at the time it seemed so incredible. It was as if he had bought shares in my future and were determined to make the trade come right. We spoke at least 3 times each day and as often as 20. The conversations during the first few months consisted of his talking and my asking questions. My job was a matter of learning to think and sound like a money spinner. Thinking and sounding like Alexander were the next best thing to being genuinely talented, which I wasn't. So I listened to the master and repeated what I heard, as in Kung Fu. It reminded me of learning a foreign language. It all seemed strange at first. Then one day, you catch yourself thinking in a language. Suddenly, words you never realized you knew are at your disposal. Finally, you dream in the language. It seems odd now to think of dreaming of money-making schemes, but it didn't seem terribly out of the ordinary when I woke up one morning thinking that there was an arbitrage available in Japanese bond futures. That morning, I looked into the Japanese market, saw that it was indeed the case, and wondered why I had dreamed of it, since I couldn't recall having ever spoken of the subject. Gobbledygook to you, perhaps, a second language to me. Many of the trades that Alexander suggested followed one of two patterns. First, when all investors were doing the same thing, he would actively seek to do the opposite. The word stockbrokers used for this approach is contrarian. Everyone wants to be one, but no one is, for the sad reason that most investors are scared of looking foolish. Investors do not fear losing money as much as they fear solitude, by which I mean taking risks that others avoid. When they are caught losing money alone, they have no excuse for their mistake. And most investors, like most people, need excuses. They are, strangely enough, happy to stand on the edge of a precipice as long as they are joined by a few thousand others. But when the market is widely regarded to be in a bad way, even if the problems are illusory, many investors get out. A good example of this was the crisis in the U.S. Farm Credit Corporation. It looked for a moment as if farm credit might go bankrupt. Investors stampeded out of farm credit bonds because, having been warned of the possibility of accident, they couldn't be seen in the vicinity without endangering their reputations. In an age when failure isn't allowed, when the U.S. government had rescued firms as remote from the national interest as Chrysler and the Continental Illinois Bank, there was no chance the government would allow the Farm Credit Bank to default. The thought of not bailing out an $80 billion institution that lent money to America's distressed farmers was absurd. Institutional investors knew this. That is the point. The people selling farm credit bonds for less than they were worth weren't necessarily stupid. They simply could not be seen holding them. Since Alexander wasn't constrained by appearances, he sought to exploit people who were. The second pattern to Alexander's thought was that in the event of a major dislocation, such as stock market crash, a natural disaster, the breakdown of OPEC's production agreements, he would look away from the initial focus on investor interests and seek secondary and tertiary effects. Remember Chernobyl? When news broke that the Soviet nuclear reactor had exploded, Alexander called. Only minutes before, confirmation of the disaster had blipped across our Crotron machines. Yet Alexander had already bought the equivalent of 2 super tankers of crude oil. The focus on investor attention was on the New York Stock Exchange, he said. In particular, it was on any company involved in nuclear power. The stocks of those companies were plummeting. Never mind that, he said. He had just purchased, on behalf of his clients, oil futures. Instantly in his mind, less supply of nuclear power equaled more demand for oil. And he was right. His investors made a large killing. Mine made a small killing. Minutes after I had persuaded a few clients to buy some oil, Alexander called back. Buy potatoes, he said. Gotta hop. Then he hung up. Of course, a cloud of fallout would threaten European food and water supplies, including the potato crop, placing a premium on uncontaminated American substitutes. Perhaps a few folks other than potato farmers think of the price of potatoes in America minutes after the explosion of a nuclear reactor in Russia, but I have never met them. But Chernobyl and oil are a comparatively straightforward example. There was a game we played called What If. All sorts of complications can be introduced into what if. Imagine, for example, you are an institutional investor managing several $billion. What if there is a massive earthquake in Tokyo? Tokyo is reduced to rubble. Investors in Japan panic. They are selling yen and trying to get their money out of Japanese stock market. What do? Well, along the lines of pattern number 1, what Alexander would do is put money into Japan on the assumption that since everyone was trying to get out, there must be some bargains. He would buy precisely those securities in Japan that appeared the least desirable to others. First, the stocks of Japanese insurance companies. The world would probably assume that ordinary insurance companies had a great deal of exposure, when in fact the risk resides mainly with Western insurers and with a special Japanese earthquake insurance company that's been socking away premiums for decades. The shares of ordinary insurers would be cheap. Then Alexander would buy a couple of $100 million worth of Japanese government bonds. With the economy in temporary disrepair, the government would lower interest rates to encourage rebuilding and simply order the banks to lend at those rates. Japanese banks would comply as usual with the government's request. Lower interest rates would mean higher bond prices. Also, the short-term panic could well be overshadowed by the long-term repatriation of Japanese capital. Japanese companies have massive sums invested in Europe and America. Eventually, they would withdraw those investments, turn inward, lick their wounds, repair their factories, and bolster their stock. What would that mean? Well, to Alexander, it would suggest buying yen. The Japanese would buy yen, selling their dollars, francs, marks, and pounds, and do so. The yen would appreciate not just because the Japanese were buying it, but because foreign speculators would eventually see the Japanese buying it and rush to join them. If the yen collapsed immediately after the quake, it would only further encourage Alexander, who sought always to do the unexpected, that his idea was a good one. On the other hand, if the yen rose, he might sell it. Each day, Alexander called and explained something new. After several months of struggling, I began to catch on. When Alexander hung up, I would call 3 or 4 investors and simply parrot what Alexander had just said. They would think me, if not a genius, then at least astute. On the basis of what I told them, they put money on the line. They made handsome profits, just like the investors to whom Alexander spoke. Soon they were calling me. Before long, they won't speak to anyone else but me. They would do whatever I, meaning Alexander, told them to do. This would soon prove very valuable. While Alexander taught me an attitude toward markets, Dash showed me style. Much of our time was spent on the telephone. By style, I mean phone technique. Dash had a little phone technique. He placed his social calls to clients in the upright seated position. He placed his sales calls hunkered over, head under his desk. He used the space beneath his desk as a kind of soundproof booth. His taste for privacy had been acquired as a geek, when he didn't want the seasoned salespeople to overhear the stupid things he was telling his customers. Now it was habit. I could tell when Dash was about to sell a few $100 million of government bonds because his torso would jackknife in his chair so that his chest was almost in his lap and his head went into the sound booth. Just before consummating the trade, he plucked his empty ear with a finger on his free hand and speak rapidly in a low voice. Then suddenly, he'd pop up, hit the silencer button on his receiver, and shout into the hood. Hey, New York, New York, you're done on October 92 and September 93s. On 100 by 110, yeah, 100 million by 110 million. Whenever he emerged from the tuck position without having sold bonds, I knew he had been talking to his mother. It wasn't cool to talk to your mother on the trading floor. I was only as conscious of miming Dash's movements on the phone and the trading floor as a child who acquires the mannerism of a parent. I had no other point of reference. I, too, soon found myself jackknifed in my chair, twirling pencils in the corner of my mouth, plugging my ear with my fingers, talking too fast and quietly for my customers to follow, and generally looking much like Dash, a phenomenon, in fact, swept across the trading floor as more and more geeks came on board. Small units of inexperienced people adopted the gestures and habits of their most successful members. As our unit grew from 5 to 10, it began to look more and more like Dash Riprock. Dash was Dash. Alexander was Alexander. I was a fraud, a composite of traits I felt rightfully belonged to these two. In my defense, I can only say that I was a very good fraud. Also, that I had one useful quality possessed neither of my teachers, a detachment from the business and the firm. It comes, I suppose, from getting your job at a fundraiser at St. James's Palace, or perhaps from having another source of income. Anyway, it is extremely helpful in a young career because it leaves you fearless. I had the same advantage of recklessness as a driver in a traffic jam with a rental car. The worst anyone could do to my rental career was take it away. And though I did not actively court that fate, the thought of losing my job didn't trouble me as much as it troubled lifers such as, say, Dash Riprock. That is not to say I did not care. I cared immensely. I thrived on praise more than most and thus sought to please. But I was willing to take greater risks than if I had felt deeply proprietary about my career. I was, for instance, willing to disobey my superiors, and that caused them to sit up and take notice far more quickly than if I had been a good soldier. Guided by Alexander and Dash, I was equipped with sound money-making schemes. a persuasive sales voice, and the right trading floor look. Business followed quickly, if haphazardly. A few small investors came to me in the manner of my unlucky German. I was able to persuade them to borrow large sums of money and speculate. With all the noise that is made about the danger of junk bonds and leveraging of American industry, it is a wonder that more attention is not paid to the daily leveraging that occurs within investors' portfolios. Say I wanted my customer to buy $30 million worth of AT&T bonds. Even if he had no cash at his disposal, he could pledge the AT&T bonds as collateral and borrow the money from Salomon Brothers to buy the bonds. We were genuinely a full-service casino. A customer didn't even need money to gamble in our house. This meant that even customers with small sums of money could be made to do large pieces of business. Since I had no large investors yet wanted to do big business and hear my name praised over the hoot and holler, I became adept at leveraging. Success bred success. Pretty soon, Salomon management was leading me to the clients of other salespeople in hopes that with larger customers, I could do gargantuan pieces of business. By June 1986, 6 months into the job, I was plugged into several of the largest pools of money in Europe. On the other end of my telephone at my peak, the investors controlled collectively about $50 billion. They were quick, aware, flexible, and rich. I had my own little full-service casino up and running, and it would, at its best, generate about $10 million a year in risk-free revenues for Salomon Brothers. We were told that each seat on the trading floor cost $600,000. If that was true, my business alone was generating more than $9 million in profits a year. I gradually ceased to worry about how much business I would do, for I was doing far more I would ever be paid for. I soon had customers in London, Paris, Geneva, Zurich, Monte Carlo, Madrid, Sydney, Minneapolis, and Palm Beach. I was perceived within Salomon Brothers to be talking to the smartest money in the market apart from a few New York fund managers. With a good money-spinning idea, I might be able to shovel $500 million or so around by, for example, moving it out of the American stock market and into the German bond market. The markets in the long run are no doubt driven by fundamental economic laws. If the United States runs a persistent trade deficit, the dollar will eventually plummet. But in the short run, money flows less rationally. Fear and, to a lesser extent, greed are what make money move. In watching the money move around, I began to anticipate its next move and maneuver a few of my $50 billion in front of the next wave. I was, in short, doing pretty well. I stopped feeling like a geek the moment Salomon Brothers started asking my advice, and sometime in the middle of 1986, more by luck than by skill, I ceased to be a geek. I became a normal established Salomon salesman. There was no one event that marked change. I knew I was no longer a geek only because people stopped calling me a geek and started calling me Michael, which I preferred. There is a difference between this, though, and being called big swinging. A big swinging I was not. The journey from useless geek to Michael took about 6 months. The journey from Michael to big swinging happened almost immediately thereafter and was occasioned by a single sale. There was a phenomenon known at Salomon as a priority. A priority was a huge number of bonds or stocks that had to be sold, either because selling them would make us rich or because not selling them would make us poor. When Texaco teetered on the brink of bankruptcy, for example, Salomon Brothers owned about $100 million worth of bonds in the company. There was a real danger that these bonds would become worthless. Unless sold to customers, they could cost Salomon a great deal of money. Sold to customers, of course, they would cost the customers a great deal of money. That, it was decided, was the best thing to do. Texaco bonds, therefore, became a priority for the Salomon sales force. One of the biggest priorities during my stay at Salomon was $86 million worth of bonds in a property development company called Olympia in York. From mid-May to mid-August of 1986, the biggest swinging in the Salomon Brothers system did their best to sell these bonds and failed. Our failure was an embarrassment to everyone, from President Tom Strauss to the lowest geek in London. One day, Alexander and I were speaking on the phone. He had tried to sell the O&Ys and failed, but he genuinely believed they had merit. O&Y bonds were an unusual priority because they were owned not by a Salomon Brothers trader, but by the single large Arab investor who ignored the blacklist and dealt with us. The Arab was desperate to sell the Olympia and Yorks and not particularly knowledgeable about them, and would probably sell them cheaply. Second, attitudes toward bonds are subject to change for a reason not much more substantial than attitudes towards the length of women's skirts. Simply because no one wanted the O&Ys now didn't mean that no one would want them 3 months from now. O&Ys were a special case because they were collateralized by a Manhattan skyscraper owned by Olympia and York rather than by the full faith and credit of the company. Many institutional investors hadn't the expertise to evaluate real estate values, but as more bonds were backed by real estate, institutional investors were learning. Of course, Salomon Brothers could simply have bought the Olympia and Yorks for itself, but Salomon was not a long-term investor, and the thought of having $86 million on the trading books for months, even years if the worst case happened and no one ever bought the bonds from us, didn't delight our management. So we salesmen were searching for another buyer, and the stakes were high. The Arab investor had offered to buy another large block of bonds if and when we rid him of the Olympia and Yorks. The combination of that and the transfer of the Olympia and York bonds from the Arab to the next owner could net the firm as much as $2 million. Now, there was no one I trusted in quite the same way I trusted Alexander, so I decided to share my secret with him. My secret was that I knew a man who'd buy the Olympia and York bonds. I had known how to sell the Olympia and York bonds for a month, but remembering my experience with AT&Ts, kept the information to myself. The investor I had in mind, a Frenchman, wouldn't want to hold them for long, only long enough for another investor to forget they'd ever turned them down. Then he'd sell them. Alexander helped me to persuade myself that if I went about selling the bonds the right way, if I'd extracted promises from senior management that my customer would not get scalped, then everyone could win. Salomon would make a lot of money. My customer would make a little money, and I would be a hero. If there was a single lesson I took away from Salomon Brothers, it is that rarely do all parties win. The nature of the game is zero-sum. $1 out of my customer's pocket was $1 in ours, and vice versa. But this was an unusual case. If management would promise to make the Olympia and York's a sales priority several months, hence remove them from my customer's portfolio at a profit, then maybe we brave few could win. Alexander did the impossible every day, and talking to him occasionally made me feel I too could do the impossible, sell a priority and keep my customer happy. I walked across the London trading floor and spoke with the trader responsible for Olympia and York bonds. He sat next to the man responsible for the AT&Ts. He said, of course, that he'd promised to keep my customer happy. Can you really sell them, though? He said. Really? Really? In his shifty eyes, there was a mixture of disbelief that the bonds could be sold and greed at the thought of the profit he would make if they were. He was making promises, but he was thinking profits. I didn't trust him. I changed my mind. I decided not to sell the bonds, but it was already too late. Just making a simple inquiry about the bonds caused the Salomon empire to leap into action. Traders hung around my desk instinctually, like dogs trying to get at in heat. Over the next 24 hours, I got calls from half a dozen salespeople in New York, Chicago, and Tokyo. They all said the same thing as the traders. Come on, please, do it and you'll be a hero. Salomon Brothers was speaking with one voice, and it was loud. None of these people, however, was in a position to make me the assurance I felt I needed. Then the phone rang at my desk. I picked it up. The voice on the other end of the line was vaguely familiar. It said, "Hey, slugger, how the are you? You think you got a chance with these bonds?" It was the grandmaster of speak, the human piranha. It was the first time we had spoken, and it turned out that responsibility for getting rid of the Olympia and York bonds fell ultimately to him. He promised that he would make sure my customer didn't get hurt, and as meaningless as that would sound coming from others, from him it mattered. I knew him by having watched him and by his reputation. He was as much was possible in a world where the buck was almighty, a man of his word. He knew the bond markets better than any man at Salomon Brothers. I trusted him. I called Alexander and told him that I was about to sell the bonds. He quickly placed bets with managing directors on the 41st floor that I would sell the bonds. He got odds of 10-1. This was insider trading at its most respectable. I then called my Frenchman and told him how a panicked Arab wanted to dump $86 million worth of bonds cheaply, how the bonds were out of fashion and undervalued compared with other similar bonds in the marketplace, and how if he bought them and held them for a few months, a buy in America might emerge. There was nothing spectacular about my sales pitch except the language in which it was couched. I used the language of the speculator. Most bond salesmen use the language of investment, analyzing the company and its prospects. I was vaguely aware that Olympia and York was involved in property. I was keenly aware that the whole world was lined up against its bonds. They were so out of fashion, I argued. They must be cheap. It was language my Frenchman understood. I knew that he, unlike most investors, would envision $86 million worth of bonds as a quick trade. I considered him my best customer. He was easily my favorite. He trusted me, I think, even though we had known each other for only 4 months. And here I was, selling him something I probably wouldn't touch with a barge pole if there hadn't been such glory in it for me. I knew it was awful, but I feel much worse about it now than I did at the time. After thinking it over for maybe a minute, he bought the $86 million worth of Olympia and Yorks. For 2 days, messages of congratulations arrived from distant points in the Salomon Brothers system. Most of the bigwigs in the firm called to say how happy they were my Frenchman had bought $86 million of O&Ys and how bright my future was at Salomon Brothers. Strauss, Massey, Ranieri, Merriweather, and Foote each called separately, right on top of each other. I happened to be away from my seat. Dash Ribrock fielded the calls and fumed, in a good-natured way, that they weren't for him. But there was a trace of seriousness to his response. I was being blessed by the gods. Dash had done well, but he had never been blessed by the gods. I saw this ritual enacted several times in my time at Salomon Brothers, but never taken to such a ridiculous extreme as when I sold those God-forsaken bonds. As a rule, the greater the praise I lavished upon the salesman within Salomon, the greater the eventual suffering of the customer. I was delighted by the bits of sticky yellow notepaper on my desk that said, Tom Strauss called to say great job, but in the back of my mind I feared for my Frenchman. Finally, the sweetness of the moment dulled the pain of knowing I had just placed my most cherished customer in jeopardy. The most important call of all came. It was from the human piranha. I heard you sold a few bonds, he said. I tried to sound calm about the whole thing. He didn't. He shouted into the phone. That is awesome. I mean awesome. I mean awesome. You are one big swinging and don't ever let anybody tell you different. It brought tears to my eyes to hear it, to be called a big swinging by the man who, years ago, had given birth to the distinction and in my mind had the greatest right to confer it upon me.
好，呢一節咧，主要就係講翻作者 Michael Lewis 自己喺 Solomon London 分行入面所做嘅嘢啦。由佢作為一個 geek， 由佢第一單完全唔識咩係 bond， 到佢一路喺度模仿佢身邊嘅人啦，模仿一兩位佢認為好識嘢嘅，專係唱反調嘅一啲 trader 啦。到佢自己連發夢都諗住學識晒呢啲咁樣嘅 jargon 啦，啲術語啦，搖身一變啊，成為一個叱咤風雲啊、呼風喚雨嘅一個 trader。當中包含咗好多欺騙啦，將佢最大嘅客買咗一啲基本上係有毒嘅債券啦，將人哋客人推入去萬劫不復。但係同一時間咧，佢亦都拯救咗佢自己嘅公司 Salomon Brothers。亦都得到一個佢認為好難得嘅稱號啦。一段咁樣嘅章節啊，一個比較個人啲嘅睇法。好，我哋睇下有啲咩字同大家分享先。Oligopoly 名詞嚟嘅 ，a state of limited competition in which a market is shared by a small number of producers or sellers。中文意思即係寡頭壟斷啦。Charlatan 都係名詞嚟嘅。 A person falsely claiming to have a special knowledge or skill。文中有一段咧，就係作者將自己都稱之為一個 Charlatan 啊，就係一個唔識就扮識、無衝內行嘅人，就係佢自己啦。最後一個 Repatriation 名詞 The sending of money back to one's own country， 將資金咧調翻去自己嘅國家啦。咁文中有提到即係80年代喺日本啦，即係假設如果日本有大地震，日本經濟崩潰，咁會發生咩事啊 ？Repatriation 咯，日本人會將啲資金調翻去本國咯。今日講到呢度，下次再同大家分享，拜拜。